The year is 2020. Technically, we're past the dystopian future drawn up by the likes of Akira and Blade Runner. Things aren't quite as far along as some people envisioned, but that hasn't stopped us from continuing to dream about a neon-drenched and crime-riddled future creeping up on the horizon to finally slide us into that outrun culture. The highly sought-after Cyberpunk 2077 is scheduled to drop in 2020, showing us that people still want to experience the future that never was. This genre is one of my favorites, and as a byproduct of that, I've been waiting a while to do this episode. Snatcher, a neo-noir cyberpunk adventure created by none other than Hideo Kojima. Also, let's fix the setup while we're at it. Much better. I've been drinking the Kojima Kool-Aid for a while now, with Metal Gear being one of my all-time favorite franchises in gaming, just barely inching out the Shin Megami Tensei Persona games. I've also been very swept up in some of the other projects Kojima's been involved with, but as I explored the Kojima catalog growing up, Snatcher in particular really stood out to me. The art was appealing, the music is phenomenal, and best of all, it satisfied my desires to explore the techno-junkie-driven universe of tomorrow. There was only one problem at the time, that is. I had no means to play it. The game was primarily a Japanese exclusive, and its only North American release was, and is, notoriously expensive. Not all iterations of the game are crazy expensive, but the MSX2 version and Sega CD versions lead the pack by considerable margins, both clocking in at over a couple $100 each. The Sega CD version is the main one I'll be focusing on for gameplay in this review, mainly because it's the only North American version, and as a result, it's the one most people are going to be familiar with. Interestingly enough, Kojima wasn't reportedly involved with the Sega CD port due to his ongoing involvement with Snatcher's spiritual successor, Policenauts. Walking back to price for a minute, as I mentioned earlier, Snatcher is an expensive game, routinely fetching above $600 for a complete in-box copy. I, of course, cannot afford that price point, so I have once again opted for a nice reproduction copy from Etsy. This set is still just as beloved to me though, because I have combined it with a copy of Snatcher's original soundtrack on cassette, which was produced and sold by Limited Run Games last year. Together, this duo makes a pseudo collector's edition for a much more palatable fraction of the price. Now let's get down to the technical details. Published and developed by Konami, Snatcher has had various releases dotting a nearly decade-long span of time, starting as early as winter 1998 with the NEC PC-8801 and the MSX2, all the way up to 1996 with the final releases on the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Somewhere within that timeline falls the Sega CD version in January of 1995 for North American audiences. Since the Sega CD version was a decent way into the series of releases for this game, several physical improvements were rolled into the game by this point, including recorded voiceovers, sharper graphics, and more colors than were present in the original versions. The most important addition, in my opinion, is the use of CD technology to produce a more robust soundtrack. I love this soundtrack to death. I mean, there's a reason why I bought it on cassette. This cassette from Limited Run Games features Snatcher's Sega CD soundtrack. It's quite interesting actually. All 6 versions of Snatcher do not share the same soundtrack, meaning that each iteration has its own unique spin on the music, whether that be with the onboard sound cards and FM synthesis, or the aforementioned CD audio. The game sounds quite different from console to console. I'm gonna give a quick shout out to another YouTube channel, Liquid Policenaut. They have done a fantastic job gathering various songs from the game and arranging them into single videos in order for you to hear the various differences. There will be a link to their playlist in the description so you can go listen to each version. While I have a preference on the soundtrack, I'm not gonna get too much into soundtrack semantics. I do have to point out, however, that the Saturn and PlayStation versions of the soundtrack are horribly botched. I don't know where they got their idea for these interpretations on the original compositions, but they are simply just an abomination. Now let's dive into the story and gameplay. For anyone expecting a high-flying action game with lots of interactivity, you better start looking elsewhere. The game is a little bit of a hybrid between a visual novel and a point-and-click adventure, with a healthy dose of tech-noir sprinkled on top. Was Blade Runner too slow for you? Or just about the right speed? That's a fairly realistic expectation of what to expect for a decent part of this game. Snatcher is pretty hands-off, with the exception of some shooting sequences tossed into every chapter. Like many of Kojima's creations, they're very movie-esque. and Snatcher might be the best one to fit that bill if you ask me. The game's opening really sets the tone for the whole game with the sharp narration and FMV playing alongside one of the game's best songs, One Night in Neo Kobe. This cutscene fills you in on the game's prologue. On June 6, 1996, an event known in-game as the Catastrophe takes place. A destructive bioweapon is released into the air when a research facility in Moscow, Russia explodes. This biohazard is known as Lucifer Alpha, and with its fall upon the world, it wipes out 80% of the population in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. The game boldly states, "Half of the world's people die." This is so very prototypically cyberpunk. Something always has to explode and then the world goes through a major change and is usually reborn as some highly corrupt Neo-City. Look at another one of my favorite cyberpunk adventures, Akira. Tokyo goes boom boom in the 1980s and then is subsequently rebuilt in Tokyo Bay sometime before 2019 as Neo Tokyo. And then it's blown up again by the end of the movie. You'd think Japan would be getting tired of this by now. Thankfully, Snatcher breaks the mold a little more with its own fictitious reconstructed island city, Neo Kobe. In the year 2047, about 50 years after the catastrophe, Bioroids started appearing in Neo Kobe. Note, Bioroid is just a fancy way of saying biological android in the game's universe. These Bioroids are referred to as Snatchers in the game because of their goal to steal or snatch an individual's identity by killing them and impersonating them. This is very much in the same vein as the sci-fi horror film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In the movie, an alien race comes down to quickly wipe out the human race by taking their place and impersonating them. Combine this premise with a large dose of Blade Runner's cat and mouse chase between man and replicant, and you basically get the premise for Snatcher. This is where our main protagonist and player character comes in. Gillian Seed is a US Special Forces agent suffering from amnesia, which conveniently gives him just enough momentum to be involved with the plot. The threat of Snatchers taking over the island is a strong possibility, which is why Junker was created to combat the Snatcher menace. Sidebar, Junker is a delightfully over-the-top acronym. It stands for Japanese Undercover Neurokinetic Elimination Ranger. What a name! Anyway, Gillian joins Junker because he feels that Snatchers are the key to figuring out his origins and past. But that's not the only person suffering from amnesia in this game. Gillian's estranged wife, Jamie Seed, is also suffering from the same memory loss under the same strange circumstances. Snatcher is the only word they seem to be able to remember, but Jamie seems a little further along in her recovery path. During the game's opening cutscene, Jamie gets a strong hunch that Snatchers are linked to something terrible in both of their pasts. As a result, Gillian decides to press on and learn more about Snatchers through his new career as a Junker. Upon entering Junker HQ, Seed meets the small team he will be working with for the rest of the game. Benson Cunningham, the Chief of Operations, Mika Slayton, a young receptionist who Gillian finds himself attracted to, and Harry Benson, the staff mechanic. There's actually another member of Junker who's not initially seen, Jean-Jacques Gibson, who is the only other active agent in the field. The game starts the player out by having Mika show the player around HQ, taking you to the various areas in the building, including the shooting range, the detective's room, the engineering room, the computer room, and of course, the chief's office. This short exposition allows the player to learn quite a bit about the mechanics of the game. For example, the shooting range gets you up to speed on the game's only form of direct action. When you enter a shooting sequence, the screen is divided up into a 3x3 grid, which you navigate by pushing the D-pad in the direction you want the crosshair to go. The shooting is a bit slippery and somewhat tricky to get used to, since you're essentially bound in only 8 rigid directions. Furthermore, it's worth noting that when you stop holding down a direction on the pad, the crosshairs always recenter to that middle section. All in all, a nice concept but clumsy execution. However, please don't let this take too much away from the game, because this is also where the coolest feature of Snatcher comes into play. You see, Snatcher is actually a light gun game too. Yes, Konami used to have a peripheral called the Justifier, which was released in conjunction with another light gun-toting game, Lethal Enforcers. The original arcade game had plastic Colt revolver-esque light guns holstered on the machine, and the eventual home ports of the game would include their own light gun revolvers. Now, Snatcher doesn't have too many shooting sequences in the game, but boy oh boy, does this thing feel extra fun to use whenever you're blasting up some bioroids. The Justifier just adds some extra pizzazz to the gameplay that you wouldn't find with other light guns like the NES Zapper. One of the other very important areas in the game is the computer room. This is where Jordan lives. Jordan is a computer terminal with a large network of data that you can access anytime in the game. In here, you can find a lot of information on the game's world and history, from high-level topics like Snatchers and Junkers to the mundane stuff like culture, science, and sports. You can use Jordan to look up other information in the game to learn more about characters and their backgrounds. There's even some fun Easter eggs stored in here, like being able to look up Hideo Kojima's record. As you would expect, Jordan comes in handy later on in the game when eventually you're forced to research some important facts about the game's world. You'll also eventually use Jordan's facial composite database to help determine what potential suspects might look like later on in the game. In the engineering room, you'll meet the aforementioned mechanic Harry Benson, where he introduces you to your faithful deuteragonist and robo-cohort, Metal Gear Mark II.
Metal Gear?
Metal Gear.
Metal is a witty, chicken-sized robot who helps the player navigate the game. He comes equipped with a video phone and a motion detector. If you haven't already guessed, he is of course a reference to the fictitious bipedal tanks from the Metal Gear franchise.
I took his basic design and his name from the Metal Gear menace of the late 20th century.
The joke actually comes full circle in Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots, where Otacon develops their own Metal Gear Mark II for Snake. It's virtually identical, except for now it has wheels instead of feet, and the video phone has been replaced with a flat screen panel instead of the standard tube monitor. After you've spent enough time gabbing with everybody and flirting with Mika multiple times, until she gets annoyed I might add, you're sent a distress call from the other field operative, Jean-Jacques Gibson. He claims that he has cornered a probable snatcher in an old abandoned factory and is requesting backup. Being the only other active junker, you are ordered to your turbo cycle by Metal Gear so you can race to the scene and help Gibson. During this sequence, the game plays one of its signature tracks, Pleasure of Tension, a piece that signals trouble will be coming your way.
Ah! Art, I don't want to alarm you, but
I read motion. Use extreme caution.
In typical noir fashion, Gillian gives an internal monologue during his ride over to the abandoned factory. The only thing he needs is some high-contrast black and white filter, a steaming coffee mug, and some saxophone music playing outside a rainy diner. Shortly after the monologue, you're dropped off at a factory, which showcases some of the most ominous imagery in the game. The stark color scheme, combined with the lighting and parallax of the clouds behind the factory, create a sense of dread. Eventually, when you exhaust all your investigative options, a cutscene takes over and you hear a blood-curdling scream from inside.
Oh no!
What was that?
Metal rattles off some information about its motion detector going off, and divulges to the player information on another form of enemy you'll be encountering throughout the game, insectors, spider-like robots that Snatchers are prone to using as a form of security measure. At this point, your only realistic option is to enter the factory and face the grim reality of Snatcher. So at this point, I'm going to put a big fat spoiler warning. Boom, done. I'm also going to recommend that viewers' discretion is advised. The game is rated T by the ESRB, but I don't think that's realistic even by today's standards. After spelunking into the creepy cooperative, you'll find Jean-Jacques' navigator, Little John, totally mangled and virtually destroyed. Things are only going to get worse from there when you find the corpse of Jean-Jacques Gibson. His head is completely ratcheted off. This scene generally happens less than 30 minutes into the game and shows you how quickly the game is willing to go off the rails. This also shows to me that the game means business and isn't afraid to get gritty. In my opinion, this game would be easily rated M by today's standards, hands down. This is probably where I'm going to cut things off regarding the plot. This game is very linear, as in there aren't really any alternate paths you can take. So I think it's for the best that you experience the game in full through maybe our long play tape recording, or by playing the game yourself. I'm going to abridge the story from here on out, showcasing only major highlights of the story. Naturally, there will be some spoilers along the way, so please be aware of that if you're the type that hates spoilers. After Jean's death, your goal is to investigate the cause and perpetrators, both of which point to the Snatcher menace. This opens up the world a bit more for Gillian and the player to meet a new set of characters, including Jean's daughter, Katrina Gibson, Napoleon, the stereotypical informant, and the mysteriously dangerous bounty hunter, Random Hajil. I won't talk too much about Random, since his whole existence is littered with plot spoilers, But what I will say is, if the Rick Deckard is a replicant theory from Blade Runner intrigues you, then the story of Random Hajil will also likely excite you. I mentioned earlier that you can flirt with Mika. Well, because Gillian is such a ladies' man, you can also flirt with Katrina. Mind you, this is shortly after her father's death. So in addition to balancing a failing marriage and sliding into the DMs of the receptionist, you now have an option to tap dance on the only other Junker's grave by putting the moves on his daughter. It comes with a cost though. If you persist, eventually you'll make Katrina mad enough that you'll get tossed out of the house and have to beg to come back inside. And since she's a vital character, you have no choice in the matter. Napoleon, the informant, is an extremely useful character, if you can look past his somewhat racist design. He helps connect Gillian to the underworld of Neo Kobe, where you'll have some of your most fun moments in the game, especially within the chapters including Plato's Cavern and Outer Heaven. Outer Heaven is a masquerade bar that you'll eventually need to get into for investigation purposes. Plato's Cavern is the black market where you buy the masks needed to access Outer Heaven. The mask I love choosing is the Moai, because it has served as the unofficial mascot for Konami, appearing way back in multiple early Konami games such as Pandora's Palace, Twinbee, and Gradius. Once you get into Outer Heaven, which is the name of Big Boss's island nation in the early Metal Gear games, it becomes a giant Konami Easter egg paradise. On the Sega CD version of Snatcher, you'll find that the bar patrons are all dressed up like famous Konami characters. Dracula and Simon Belmont from Castlevania, Bill and Lance from Contra, Goemon from the Mystical Ninja games, and finally, Sparkster from Rocket Knight Adventures. In earlier versions of the game, Outer Heaven featured various sci-fi characters, like the Xenomorph from Alien, but these characters were removed from the Sega CD version due to copyright concerns, so it was for the best that Konami just used their own licensed characters. The game is just chock full of fun little references and homages. It is also very aware of itself as a video game. For example, at the end of the game, when Metal Gear gets an upgraded body, his body style reflects the console that the player has just experienced the game on. As you might have noticed with the earlier comments regarding the soundtracks in Outer Heaven, there's a solid list of differences in the various versions of the game. The first and foremost being that there are 3 acts in the base game, but earlier versions of Snatcher on the PC-8801 and MSX2 did not feature this third act. In typical Kojima fashion, the project was very ambitious. It was over budget and over time, so they originally left the second act of the game as a cliffhanger. The other major differences between the iterations of Snatcher is censorship. When games come to North America from Eastern territories, oftentimes censorship accompanies the Western game releases. Regarding Snatcher, the violence was censored to some extent, but it was mainly the adult content, like nudity, that was changed for the North American release. I mentioned earlier that you have the option to flirt with Gibson's daughter, Katrina. And aside from the rather gratuitous shower scene, an important detail is Katrina's age difference between the versions. In North America, she's 18 years old. However, in Japan, she's only 14, which is shocking to Western audiences, but that's enough about censorship. This game totally took a back seat to the Sega CD game that truly caught all the controversy during this era, Night Trap. That's pretty much a symptom of the whole thing. The game really never got much of a spotlight of any kind in the Western world. But thanks to the internet, the word about Snatcher has spread and the game has achieved cult status in America. While it's not even close to being worth the multi-$100 price tag that it fetches, it is certainly worth your time to play through and experience the Snatcher universe. The game has its flaws, namely in the third act because the game is prone to dragging itself out at times and getting a little stuck in its own hubris with a strange blend of both comedy and serious undertones. But at the same time, if you've ever played any of Hideo Kojima's other games, you're probably familiar with this type of goofy yet serious tone already. Snatcher has gone on to make quite a few appearances outside its original incarnation. Aside from the earlier reference in Metal Gear Solid 4 with Metal Gear Mark II, it has been referenced in the Fallout series occasionally, and it also had a huge role in one of the bonus missions in Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, Jamais Vu, in which the player has to scan enemies to see if they've been snatched and eliminate them. This is, of course, a giant homage to Snatcher, and it comes packaged with a few references and music from the game to boot. The world of Snatcher will have you grinning from ear to ear if you're a fan of Kojima, sci-fi, cyberpunk adventures, or all of the above. However, if you're looking to deepen your Snatcher experience, check out Speed King, a rare Japanese exclusive racing game for the PS1. This game is set in Neo Kobe's world and even lets you choose a vehicle very similar to the Turbo Cycle to race around the city, with gameplay similar to Wipeout and F-Zero. Or perhaps you like Snatcher's premise but not the point-and-click playstyle. Enter SD Snatcher, a more humorous take on the game in a cute RPG style. The SD in SD Snatcher stands for Super Deformed, a reference to the deliberate chibi style of the characters. Thankfully, there are a plethora of ways to experience Snatcher and its related media through the use of emulations, reproductions, extended long plays, and original pressings. If you've got the cash, of course. The legacy left behind by Snatcher is noteworthy. The game is still very much appreciated by fans to this day, even with no new releases in the last 20 years. Though fans have asked for reboots, modern ports, or even a sequel of the game, none have surfaced. And with Kojima no longer at Konami, it seems like the franchise is destined to become lost in time, like tears in rain.